Hey everyone, Ramadan Mubarak. This is Azza again, Executive Director here at CAIR-AZ. We have a very, very special guest with us today, Lindsay Love, who is a Chandler Unified School District Governing Board member who's dedicated her life to social justice issues. She works closely with teens and adults who have experienced trauma. And in the governing board, she has prioritized mental health, equal opportunity, and QIA protection, and many other issues. Lindsay, I've seen you, in board meetings, and you've always been an advocate and someone I truly admire in the community. But how are you? Thanks for being here.
I'm surviving. This pandemic is out to get us, but I've gotten 2 vaccines and I've managed to survive up to this point. So I can only say that I'm blessed.
I feel that. It's been quite a couple of years. I know you also do therapy as well. So this is you have a therapy practice as well, and that's I'm sure you've seen a lot.
Oh yeah, I started my practice during the pandemic, Therapy Love, for those of you who, it's all one word, LUV. But I started it during the pandemic because I think not just COVID, but also the racial unrest and the racialized trauma. Black folks did not really have a place to go for therapy. People of color don't really have places to go for therapy where our unique racialized traumas are taken seriously. So I decided to be the change and create something that I didn't see out there. And August, I will be in practice for a year. So, yeah.
Yeah, I'm super excited for that. I'll make sure I plug it in. Lindsay, will you please send me the website? That way I can add the link to our post. So if anyone needs a therapist.
Yeah.
We got Lindsay with lots of love. Lindsay, I'm very curious. As you know, CAIR-AZ is a civil rights organization that works with a lot with the Muslim community here, right? I know our community is not they vote, they get out there, but there is a lot of, I guess, missing pieces when it comes to some positions school board members and the things that you guys actually do. There's lots of educational pieces that are missing, right? Well, I want to actually, let me backtrack a little bit. I want to know how you got started into doing this work. Why did you run to become a school board member?
So I've been a social worker for about, I think now I'm coming up on 9-10 years right now. And I used to work with children and families. I worked for organizations that were focused on 6 and up. We served birth to death, essentially. So I've worked with children, I've worked with adults. And a lot of the work that I did with children, a lot of their trauma was taking place in the school system, particularly for our most marginalized students, like our LGBTQIA students, our BIPOC students, our students who were, in SPED services. Also, there's that religious discrimination and trauma as well. So a lot of their trauma was taking place within the schools, a lot of bullying, a lot of push out. It was happening to my niece and nephew. And I had my youngest niece, Quinn, who was just about to start kindergarten in Chandler as well. And I didn't want her to have those experiences. I looked at the statistics, and I'd worked in therapeutic group homes where a lot of what we talk about is the adultification of BIPOC children, particularly Black girls. And that starts at 5, even before 5, where we're seeing our children get into trouble, get criminalized, right? They get into trouble more than their white counterparts. And looking at my niece who was bubbly, smiley, precocious, I didn't want the school system to take the things that my family loves about my niece, like some of her like funny defiance. I didn't want them to criminalize her, and I didn't want her to grow up in a system that told her that her body was wrong, which we see a lot with Black children. We see that turn into a lot of like trauma, eating disorders, cutting, a lot of mental health issues that we don't really talk about or address with Black students, because we also have an issue with help-seeking behavior too, because we don't trust systems. We've been let down by systems. And part of my professional ethics is to fight for that social justice in those micro, macro, meso levels. And so being that social worker where I was working more on the micro, it was time for me to look at what can I do to impact policy. And the policy changes that I wanted to see started with children, because working with children, that's prevention work. That is the work that puts me out of work, mind you, because I wouldn't have these children transitioning into adulthood and having to deal with traumas that they've experienced for years and years as children. That's kind of my long answer, short answer. And then my sister also asked me to run because she was like, you're a social worker, you should do it. And I was like, okay, I'll do it.
I mean, this is kind of like a real great segue to go into the next question, because I didn't know what a school board member did till like maybe like 5-6 years ago, right? So growing up, like as a kid, or even in my 20s, I didn't really know what a school board member does. Can you tell us like what a school board member does, just so I'm sure I'm not the only person in this boat, like I know there's plenty of folks, especially in the community, that feel the same way.
Yeah. I think a lot of people don't know what school boards do, or that we even exist, right? And how you get on a school board. A lot of people look at the schools that their community schools that they send their children to, and they think the buck stops with the principal, right? But there's a whole administration and superintendent, and our school boards, they oversee the superintendent. That's our only employee. We don't oversee the teachers. We don't oversee the assistant superintendents. Our only employee is the superintendent, who's kind of like at the top of the scale, the leadership hierarchy, right? With that, we oversee the budgets within the district, and we also create policies that the superintendent takes, and she makes sure that the rest of the district, or her assistant superintendents, principals, and other site leaders, teachers carry out those policies and procedures, and makes budgetary and financial decisions based upon what the board does. So it's a lot. We don't get paid for service in the state of Arizona, and it is an elected position. So you have to collect enough signatures to get on the ballot, which means you got to get out and knock doors like some of our, House and Senate members. Those are the big races that people pay attention to out here in Arizona. But you got to knock doors. You got to get enough signatures to get on the ballot. You got to keep knocking doors to get your lid out there so that you can get enough votes to get on the board. It's one of those positions that people don't pay attention to, and so people tend to walk onto school boards. And the interesting thing is that if you look at nationally what the makeup of school boards, it's usually white, older, more affluent people who are getting seats on school boards, and there are not a lot of people that are sitting at the table that look like us.
Yeah, that takes me to my next question. Why do you think it's important for like parents to be involved there, and also the community, right? Because
Mhm.
I know, like I've seen you fight for, a few issues. Like I've been to some of your board meetings where you usually have, like folks filling up, the whole building. I think the last time I went, I had to stand like this squished with everybody next to me because everybody was coming to like support you.
Yeah.
um so can you, like I want to go more in depth to why it's really important for like our communities to have representation in these tables, right? Like what kind of decisions are being made that actually affect the kids in the district and like our
Mhm.
communities.
Well, so I think like let me take it from a different approach, right? Like let's think of that meeting where, people showed up in support of me, the district. There were some other policy things like equity and comprehensive age appropriate sex education, right? We had two camps. There were the ones who supported those things and the ones who didn't, right? Typically, our meetings don't have anybody in there, right? However, there are more affluent white parents who show up. And they're not only just showing up to school board meetings because school boards are the closest level of government to the community, right? There's a lot of access to us. You run into us at the grocery store. You can email us. You could show up and yell and scream at us, right? That's where action is taking place. But these people were also running to the Capitol because there were some big names at the Capitol to impose policies that restrict us from doing the things that we need to do, like creating inclusive bullying policies that protect marginalized students or protect the parents that call CAIR, right? Because their child is being bullied, right? They go to the Capitol to restrict us in being able to keep those children safe. And these are parents who have a lot of money, they have a lot of influence, and they're definitely not trying to protect the best interest of all children. They're trying to protect the best interest of our most privileged children, right? And those are the children who our education system has traditionally worked for. They, those children graduate, they make great grades, nobody's pushing them out, they become successful and go on to secondary education, right? But our students who don't, right, it's because our system has kind of been built to make sure that there's some division. And so, I'll say it, like white supremacy is basically what our schools have been built off of, where some students succeed and some do not, right? And who is it? It's our most marginalized students. It's our BIPOC students who struggle because we're putting in these policies that make it so we're targeting them and punishing them and pushing them out, right? It's our SPED students, right, who can't get the services that they need, right? There's a lot in there, our less affluent students, right? Because equity is not just about race, right? It's also about class, it's about ability, and many other things, right? But our system is set up to make sure that those students have some obstacles and barriers put in place. So the short answer is when parents aren't aware of the voices that are showing up in these meetings and forcing the school board's hand, these people are showing up and making threats, like our meetings around COVID and reopening and mask policies, which was our most recent meeting last night. They're showing up and threatening to unenroll students so that the school district, that's how we get our money, is students, so that the school district fails. And when the school district fails, we are failing our most marginalized students even more. And so it's important for parents to show up and be that voice, because we're getting drowned out by these voices that don't want to see our kids succeed. And they'll tell you they want to see our kids succeed, but they want to see their kids succeed at the expense of your kid. So your children are on the menu when you don't show up to school board meetings, you don't vote, you don't, pay attention to those down ballot races. Very long answer, but
No, that's exactly the answer, we needed. And also running for that position too, like you don't have to be super political, but running for that position, you know, like especially like in the Muslim community, in the Black community, in the Latinx community, like you want to see change in your community, running for these sort of positions right now is like super important, you know, to have that representation, to be like able to say like, no, we're not going to be able to get vaccines for our kids right now, so we're going to be wearing masks.
Mm-hmm.
My kids need to wear masks in school because we can't, or there's 10 of us that live in one house, and we can't have, you know, my son or daughter bring in, you know, COVID to the house.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to remember that the Chandler Unified School District is not just made up of Chandler residents. Our district was drawn, our boundaries were drawn before, you know, the boundaries for our cities were drawn, right? So we go through Chandler, we go through Gilbert, and we go through Queen Creek, parts of Queen Creek, right? And so Chandler High, you know it, it's our oldest high school, and all the schools in that area during COVID, they were in the red. They were losing people. I lost a coach, a swim coach to COVID, right? Those are your families too who live in that area, who live in like multi-generational households. Parents maybe are working, children may be working to support their siblings as well in their family during the pandemic, right? Those are the populations that were getting sick. They were dying. One person would get sick and it would infect the whole household, right? Those were the families who did not have the privilege to show up to our meetings. And those were the families who, ironically enough, are more affluent families who lived more on that Gilbert, Queen Creek side, and, you know, parts of our more affluent Chandler side. Those were the families that those more affluent families would kind of use in their narrative to say, this is why we need to reopen, because if we're not open, think of our poor, marginalized students over here who are not getting the education that they need, which really, for those families, education, yes, is important, but survival is also more important. And COVID was a threat to their survival, not just physical, right, but also financially. And so those parents were showing up and exploiting the stories of these families who had little resources to get schools open for their children, their white, more affluent children. And so those are the things that people need to pay attention to. When we ask, why did the school district make this decision to open up the schools when the district was in the red? There's a reason, and those reasons can be found in those meetings. If you go back, they're all on camera, and we had parents showing up loud and demanding that we reopen.
Yeah, Lindsay, and it's so important to know that this is not just in Chandler. There's, you know, the Phoenix Unified School District. How many are there here?
School districts, there's a lot. There's a lot, but yeah, I mean, there's school districts across the state. Mesa is our largest, like, you know, I think us and Tucson Unified kind of flip the coin sometimes, but there's school districts across the state and across the country. And a lot of these narratives are playing out, particularly when we talk about equity. We're seeing a deep white lash to equity because, you know, you have these families who are intimidated by my presence on the board, or, you know, by, you know, Burdetta Hodge's presence on the board, right? Because there's always one of us somewhere, right?
Yeah.
And you know, we're talking about our marginalized students who didn't have a voice prior to, and that's a threat to these families, right? And so this narrative is playing out across the country, and people aren't paying attention to the role of school boards.
Yeah, I guess, and this is the last question, and I think it's one of the most important ones. How can people get more educated on this? Like, how can they get involved? What do you suggest they do? Like websites, how can they get involved and know what issues are being put on the table for these board
Mhm.
meetings, right?
So the board has to post their meetings and they have to post the agenda to their meetings. And so, parents can get on the district website generally and look at the board agenda prior to the meetings to see what issues are coming up. And, if there's an issue that they feel really passionate about, they can email the board or they can show up to the meeting if they have that privilege to do so. Not everybody does. The agenda is also posted with meeting minutes after the board meeting. And then, for Chandler Unified, we record our meetings. So you can always see our meetings on our YouTube channel. You can always see the outcome of certain decisions online through our agenda. You can review curriculum with all districts, right? There's a 60-day review process for all like curriculum and even policy changes before we vote on them. So families have the ability to review those things and then raise any concerns to the superintendent and the board. So that's one way of kind of getting involved, especially as we're talking about equity. That conversation does lead into representation and how students are represented in curriculum and policy. And we'd love to hear that feedback from more diverse voices within the community. I think too, run for office, school board, I think is going to become more of a competitive race. And we have seen that with like some of these last races, but typically people have just been kind of walking onto these boards without a real election, right? Run. It does seem like it's a lot of time, but it's not. We meet like about 2 times a month. We had some more meetings this month because of masks and other COVID things. And last month we were finalizing our assistant superintendent search. But yeah, I mean, running for office to get on the seats on these tables, and then also making sure that you're showing up for the candidates that you support, because the things that you value those candidates embody, you can hold them accountable, but then there's also going to be people on the other side who are going to be trying to silence that candidate, especially for candidates coming out of like marginalized groups or school board members coming out of marginalized groups. We know that we tend to get silenced even when we're at the table, or our representation is more, see, we do care about Black children. See, we do care about, these children, but there's no real listening to those members and no real value in action. And so it's up to the community to kind of hold the board in full accountable, because we put this member here. We want this member to serve us. What are you doing to listen to them?
And a reminder, like all elected officials are public servants, and I think we often forget that they're here to serve the community. So if you're not asking them for your needs, someone else is, right?
Yeah.
Like if your kids are being bullied in school because of religion or race or anything, like if your child is being marginalized in any way, you can you can be more involved to be able to make the rules for your district.
Yeah.
Otherwise, like you said earlier, like they're on the menu. Like
Yeah.
no one's gonna care if you're not standing up for your children and like having a seat at the table, then you don't really have a say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, we get called. I know that I get calls from parents who they're very upset because their child is being bullied, right? For whatever the community is not accepted, whether that's like religion, race, class. And what ultimately happens is those students get pushed out into another school either within the district or charter or private school where they can be accepted, right? And so we really need to be looking at that as a community and really holding the community accountable too, because I will tell you, we do have some schools in our district, and there's some schools across the state where people would be happy to not have like BIPOC kids or Muslim kids, you know, and do their level best to push those students out to make sure that, you know, it's white, it's Christian, you know, whatever the case may be. A lot of our opposition has been that, you know, we're creating division, but, you know, and talking about like equity and talking about like how color blindness is harmful to our students. But when we don't really look at our students and their diverse backgrounds, we miss things like the fact that we are targeting certain groups in our punishment policies. Certain groups aren't graduating. Certain groups aren't, you know, given the opportunity to go for advanced placement. Certain groups, you know, are dropping out, right? So we need to have these conversations where we recognize this, but our community is the biggest barrier because our community feels that talking about these issues creates division. And then there's a question of like, do they really believe that? Or is it more that they're okay with some children being harmed as long as their children get ahead?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I think you hit it right in the head. Is that the saying?
Yeah. Yes. Yes.
I think,
you hit the nail on the head. Yeah.
nail in the head. Yeah.
Yeah.
You know, where it's like, if my child is not being harmed, I don't really care, you know, how these other children are being harmed or what their situation is at home. And, you know, it's an issue of empathy too, right? We should do that too.
Yeah. Like a lot of our families are missing that empathy piece. And, you know, I can't say that it's not understandable in terms of, you know, their focus is they have a child that they are responsible for till at least the age of 18, and they just want to get this child to the finish line. They're very protective of their children, right? So they may not be thinking about your children. They may be thinking like, you know, your children are your responsibility. My child is my responsibility. We're very individualistic as a society here in the US, right?
Yeah.
But we know that our communities of color, I think too, you know this with the Muslim community as well, it's very much a collectivist kind of society where we take care of each other. And you have these two ideologies that clash. You have parents who are more individualistic who feel like, well, wait a minute, you're pushing my child out. Like, you know, the focus needs to be on my child. And if, you know, these parents aren't getting their children to the level that my child is, you know, then that's their problem. And that's their focus, right? But us collectivist people are like, no, like, this is a community effort, right? And if the community is not providing for the needs of that child or for the needs of all children, then there's a problem. And so it's kind of like two clashing ideologies that come into play with racism, Islamophobia, and all the other isms and phobias. And it makes for a very interesting debate among our community.
Interesting and very hard to watch a lot of the times.
Hard to experience too. But I think looking at, you know, the amount of bullying that I've faced or the death threats that I've gotten, Burdetta Hodge with somebody hacking, you know, into her birthday and threatening her life and calling her the N-word, Calvin Good, you know, happened at his funeral, right?
Yep.
You know, thinking about like how Black public officials get targeted and bullied in the ways that we do. And then, you know, thinking about how, okay, like if this can happen publicly to public officials, what's happening with our students? Is it worse because it's happening behind closed doors? And what's the impact to them?
Exactly. And Lindsay, like I've seen, you know, like how you've been targeted. It has been, you know, pretty bad for the last couple of years, you know. At some point, I'm like, I think she's gonna maybe get rid of her social media. you know, because it was just like, you know, it was horrific. So I can only imagine when you don't have a parent with
Mhm.
you, right? Like these kids and the amount of bullying that's happening in school. And that goes back to like the importance of therapists, you know, and
Yeah. And, if you look, like, a lot of school districts got grants for social workers and counselors. Chandler, we have a memorandum of understanding with Southwest. And if a student is struggling with some kind of like issue in school with peers in the community, you can always turn to those social workers and counselors for referrals for behavioral health services. And then there's also different like referral sources if you're looking for a specific counselor, like if you're looking for a Black counselor, if you're looking for a counselor that has a certain like religious affiliation, or an LGBTQ friendly counselor. There are referral sources that parents can look into to get their students the help that they need. I've never thought about deleting my social media because I think that being a public figure, having that being seen so publicly really does shine a spotlight on that, to the point where we have national news calling me to interview me about the white lash in Chandler, because communities outside of ours can see what's going on. People within our community
making
can't.
it to national news.
Mhm.
And not in a good way again in Arizona, right?
Oh yeah, I've been on NPR. NPR is calling me for another interview tomorrow, because it's not just our community that this is happening in, right? This is happening in suburban communities across the country, and like we said, COVID is not the only pandemic, right? Racism, Islamophobia, those have been pandemics, right?
Yeah.
Um, and so it's interesting to kind of look at it in the backdrop of like, a Derek Chauvin, or, the other young lady who just died out of Columbus, Nakia Bryant. So it's interesting to kind of like, people are having those conversations because things like this are happening in the spotlight. And I think my social media being so public and so contentious kind of helps shine the light on these issues. So people can continue to troll me, but they're not making it worse on me. They're actually putting the spotlight in the mirror up to themselves, where people are looking at it and calling it what it is.
That is a great way to look at it.
Mm-hmm.
That is a great way to look at it.
Yeah.
Well, Lindsay, I honestly, this has been such an amazing conversation. And I can talk to you for like 20 hours straight.
Yes.
Knowledge. And not only that, like, you're just awesome. And your perspective is always loved by me.
Aww.
So, yeah, I thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you. I can't wait till we get to see you in person. And you are going to be in office till the end of 2022. So, we're going to be reaching out to you. Um, Make sure you send us your link to your
Will do.
therapy practice. Also, everyone, thank you for watching. Hope you enjoyed this. Please drop some questions under the comments. And feel free to reach out to CAIR if you want to, get in touch with Lindsay. And yes, have a wonderful day, and we'll see you all soon.
Bye.